What if I told you there's an ancient book that was so dangerous, so controversial, that it was completely erased from Western Christianity for over 1,000 years? A book that early church fathers quoted extensively, that the Apostle Paul himself referenced, and that was found in more copies at Qumran than almost any other biblical text. Yet this same book was systematically hunted down and destroyed so thoroughly that scholars thought it was lost forever. This is the story of the Book of Jubilees, sometimes called the Little Genesis, and today we're going to uncover why this ancient text terrified religious authorities so much that they launched one of history's most complete censorship campaigns against it. We're talking about a suppression so effective that for centuries, this book existed only in fragments hidden within the writings of early Christian leaders. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. When archaeologists discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves of Qumran, they found something that shook the foundations of biblical scholarship. Multiple copies of this forbidden book, preserved in Hebrew, sitting right alongside the most sacred texts of Judaism and early Christianity. The very book that had been branded as heretical and dangerous was being treasured and copied by the same communities that gave us some of our most important biblical manuscripts. If you're ready to dive deep into this mystery, if you want to understand why a book that was once considered scripture by many became forbidden knowledge, then drop a Y in the comments right now. And make sure you're subscribed to the Kingdom Lore, because what we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about how our biblical canon was formed. The Book of Jubilees presents itself as nothing less than direct divine revelation. According to its own testimony, this is the account that God gave to Moses during those 40 days and nights on Mount Sinai, delivered not by God directly, but through an angel of the presence. Picture this scene. Moses stands on the holy mountain, receiving not just the stone tablets we know about, but an entirely separate revelation about the hidden history of the world from creation to his own time. The book claims to reveal the true chronology of biblical events, dividing all of history into periods of 49 years called Jubilees. This isn't just ancient storytelling. This is a text that positions itself as the missing piece of biblical revelation, the secret history that explains what really happened in those early days of creation and the patriarchs. But here's where it gets fascinating. The Book of Jubilees doesn't just retell the stories we know from Genesis and Exodus. It expands them, fills in the gaps, and provides details that you won't find anywhere else in Scripture. It tells us the names of Adam and Eve's daughters. It gives us a completely different timeline for when events occurred. It reveals conversations between God and the patriarchs that aren't recorded in the biblical text. And perhaps most controversially, it presents an entirely different calendar system. While the Jewish authorities of the time followed a lunar calendar borrowed from Babylon, Jubilees insisted on a solar calendar of exactly 364 days. This wasn't just a minor theological disagreement. This meant that the holy days, the festivals, the Sabbaths themselves would fall on completely different dates, depending on which calendar you followed. Imagine the chaos this would create. Picture Jewish communities split down the middle, with some celebrating Passover on one date and others celebrating it weeks apart. The practical implications were staggering, but the theological implications were even more profound. If Jubilees was right, then the religious establishment had been following the wrong calendar for generations. The early Christian community was deeply influenced by texts like Jubilees. We can trace clear quotations and references to this book throughout the writings of the apostles and early church fathers. When Paul writes in 2 Corinthians about God being a father to his people, he's not just drawing from 2 Samuel. He's echoing language that appears almost identically in the Book of Jubilees. Justin Martyr quoted it, Origen referenced it. Epiphanius knew it well. These weren't marginal figures debating obscure theological points. These were the pillars of early Christianity, and they treated Jubilees as authoritative scripture. In fact, scholars today can reconstruct almost the entire Greek text of Jubilees just from the quotations preserved in early Christian writings. So what happened? How did a book that was so widely known, so frequently cited, so obviously important to early Christianity, become completely forbidden? The answer lies in one of the most dramatic shifts in religious history. During the 4th century, as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, church leaders faced an unprecedented challenge. They needed to standardize Christian doctrine across a vast and diverse empire. They needed to decide which books would be considered authoritative and which would be rejected. But there was another factor at play. The early Christian communities had been heavily influenced by Jewish groups like the Essenes, who favored books like Jubilees and Enoch. However, by the 4th century, mainstream Judaism had largely rejected these same texts. The Pharisaic tradition, which survived the destruction of the temple and became Rabbinic Judaism, wanted nothing to do with the sectarian literature that had been popular at Qumran and among other Jewish groups. Christian leaders found themselves at a crossroads. Should they maintain the texts that had been important to their predecessors, or should they align themselves with contemporary Jewish scholarship? The decision they made would have profound consequences for the preservation of ancient literature. They chose alignment. They chose to side with the Jewish authorities of their time and reject the texts that those authorities found problematic. This wasn't necessarily a theological decision based on careful study of the texts themselves. It was a political decision designed to create unity and avoid controversy. But the Book of Jubilees presented specific problems that went beyond politics. Its calendar system, as we mentioned, created practical difficulties. A solar year is actually 365¼ days, not 364. This meant that the Jubilees calendar would gradually drift out of sync with the actual seasons. Within 30 years, harvest festivals would be occurring before the harvest was ready. The system was mathematically elegant, but practically unworkable. More troubling to religious authorities were the book's legal pronouncements. Jubilees didn't just retell biblical stories. It added new laws, new punishments, new requirements that went far beyond what was written in the accepted scriptures. For instance, it declared that anyone who ate blood should be completely rooted out of the land along with all their descendants. It demanded that fathers who gave their daughters in marriage to Gentiles should be stoned to death. These weren't minor additions. These were fundamental expansions of biblical law that would have required massive changes to how Jewish and Christian communities operated. Religious authorities who were trying to maintain order and unity in their communities saw these additions as dangerous innovations that threatened established practice. The book also contained elaborate teachings about angels that many found troubling. It described 4 distinct classes of angels with specific roles and responsibilities. It provided detailed accounts of fallen angels mating with human women and producing the race of giants known as the Nephilim. It claimed that after the flood, God allowed 10% of the disembodied spirits of these giants to remain active in the world to tempt and mislead humanity. For religious authorities who preferred simpler, more controlled theological frameworks, these elaborate supernatural systems were problematic. They opened the door to speculation and interpretation that could lead communities away from established doctrine. But perhaps most threatening of all was the book's claim to divine authority. The Book of Jubilees didn't present itself as commentary or interpretation. It claimed to be direct revelation from God, delivered through an angel to Moses himself. This put it in direct competition with the established scriptures, and in some cases, it directly contradicted those scriptures. For example, Jubilees absolutely forbade fasting on the Sabbath, declaring it punishable by death. Yet Moses himself had fasted for 40 consecutive days, including Sabbaths, when he received the law on Mount Sinai. The book's own claimed source, Moses, had violated one of its most strict commandments. How could a truly divine text contain such contradictions? These theological problems provided religious authorities with scriptural grounds for rejecting Jubilees while maintaining their commitment to biblical authority. They could argue that the contradictions proved the book was not truly divine, regardless of its claims. The suppression that followed was unlike anything in the ancient world. Religious authorities didn't just stop copying the book or remove it from their libraries. They actively sought out existing copies and destroyed them. They warned against reading it. They declared it heretical. The campaign was so effective that by the medieval period, no complete Hebrew, Greek, or Latin version existed anywhere in the Western world. This wasn't accidental neglect. This was systematic eradication. The book had been too popular, too influential, too widely distributed to simply disappear through natural attrition. It required coordinated effort across multiple institutions and centuries of sustained opposition. Yet even as Jubilees was being erased from Western Christianity, it found refuge in one of the most unlikely places imaginable. Far to the south, in the highlands of Ethiopia, Christian communities were developing along completely different lines. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church was isolated from the theological controversies raging in the Roman Empire. They preserved texts that were being destroyed elsewhere, and they developed a biblical canon that was far more inclusive than what emerged in the West. In Ethiopia, the Book of Jubilees wasn't forbidden. It was scripture. It was copied, studied, preached from, and treasured as part of the divine revelation given to Moses. While Western scholars were forgetting that the book had ever existed, Ethiopian Christians were incorporating its teachings into their worship, their calendar, and their understanding of biblical history. This preservation would prove to be one of the most important acts of cultural conservation in human history. When European scholars finally gained access to Ethiopian manuscripts in the modern period, they discovered that an entire library of ancient texts had survived the centuries of suppression. Books that had been lost for over 1,000 years in the West had been carefully preserved in G.'s translation by Ethiopian Christians who never doubted their divine authority. The Ethiopian Orthodox Biblical Canon contains 81 books, making it the largest and most diverse biblical canon in traditional Christianity. Among these books are several that were completely unknown to Western scholarship until relatively recently. The preservation of Jubilees alongside texts like 1st Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah reveals just how much ancient religious literature was lost through the systematic suppression campaigns of late antiquity. But the Ethiopian preservation of Jubilees was just the beginning of its remarkable comeback. The real vindication would come in the 20th century, in caves overlooking the Dead Sea, where ancient scribes had hidden their most precious manuscripts before their community was destroyed by Roman armies. When archaeologists began exploring the caves of Qumran in 1947, they made discoveries that revolutionized our understanding of ancient Judaism and early Christianity. Among the hundreds of scrolls and thousands of fragments they found, one text appeared more frequently than almost any other non-biblical book. The Book of Jubilees was represented by at least 15 separate manuscripts found in 5 different caves. Think about what this means. The people who lived at Qumran, who produced some of our most important biblical manuscripts, who were contemporary with Jesus and the apostles, considered Jubilees important enough to copy multiple times and store in their most secure locations. They weren't treating it as curiosity or historical artifact. They were treating it as scripture. The abundance of Jubilees manuscripts at Qumran was matched only by the most important biblical books: Psalms, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Exodus, and Genesis. This wasn't a fringe text that appealed to a few sectarian scholars. This was a central document in the religious life of one of the most significant Jewish communities of the Second Temple period. The implications are staggering. For over 1,000 years, Western Christianity had operated under the assumption that books like Jubilees were rightfully excluded from the biblical canon because they were never truly accepted by ancient Jewish and Christian communities. The Dead Sea Scrolls proved that assumption completely wrong. The Forbidden Book hadn't been forbidden at all, at least not initially. It had been scripture, studied, and copied alongside the books that did make it into our modern Bibles. Its exclusion wasn't the result of ancient consensus. It was the result of later political and theological decisions made by religious authorities who were dealing with completely different challenges than those faced by the original Jewish and Christian communities. The discovery of multiple Jubilees manuscripts at Qumran wasn't just an archaeological find. It was a theological earthquake that forced scholars to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the formation of the biblical canon. Here were ancient scribes living at the time of Christ, treating this forbidden book as holy scripture worthy of preservation alongside the most sacred texts of their tradition. But the plot thickens even further when we examine exactly what the Qumran community believed about these texts. The sectarian writings found in the same caves reveal a group that saw themselves as the true inheritors of God's covenant, the faithful remnant who had preserved the authentic traditions, while mainstream Judaism had fallen into corruption. They weren't random rebels collecting controversial books. They were meticulous scholars who believed they were preserving divine truth. The Hebrew manuscripts of Jubilees found at Qumran date back to around 125 BCE, making them among the oldest copies we possess. These weren't late copies influenced by centuries of scribal errors and theological modifications. These were early versions close to the original composition, preserved by people who had every reason to ensure their accuracy. And what did these ancient Hebrew texts reveal? They confirmed that the Ethiopian version, preserved in Gia's translation for over a millennium, had maintained remarkable fidelity to the original. While Western scholars had dismissed the Ethiopian manuscripts as potentially corrupt translations of a questionable text, the Qumran discoveries proved that the Ethiopian Church had faithfully preserved one of the most important religious documents of the Second Temple period. This validation transformed our understanding of Ethiopian Christianity itself. Far from being an isolated African church that had collected random apocryphal texts, the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition emerged as a crucial link to ancient Christianity, preserving literary treasures that had been systematically destroyed elsewhere. Their looser approach to canonicity, which had been criticized by Western scholars, suddenly appeared as wisdom rather than laxity. The theological implications of the Qumran findings extend far beyond questions of canonicity. The Book of Jubilees wasn't just popular at Qumran. It was foundational to their understanding of biblical chronology, their calendar system, and their interpretation of God's covenant with Israel. The sectarian documents reference Jubilees repeatedly, treating its chronological framework as authoritative for understanding God's plan for history. This raises profound questions about the relationship between the Qumran community and early Christianity. Many scholars now believe that John the Baptist may have had connections to Qumran or similar sectarian groups. The parallels between Qumran theology and certain aspects of early Christian thought are striking. If these communities were deeply influenced by texts like Jubilees, and if early Christians emerged from similar theological environments, then the later suppression of these books represents a dramatic departure from Christianity's own roots. Consider the implications for our understanding of the New Testament itself. When Paul quotes what appears to be the Book of Jubilees in his letters, he's not drawing from some obscure sectarian text. He's referencing a book that was widely known and respected in the Jewish communities of his time. When the author of Hebrews discusses the chronology of biblical events, the framework he uses shows clear parallels to the Jubilee system found in this forbidden book. The early church fathers who quoted Jubilees extensively weren't engaging in theological speculation or citing interesting but non-authoritative sources. They were drawing from a text that many of their predecessors and contemporaries considered to be genuine divine revelation. The later suppression of these quotations and references represents a systematic rewriting of early Christian intellectual history. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Jubilee suppression is what it reveals about the arbitrary nature of canonical decisions. The same religious authorities who declared Jubilees heretical and dangerous preserved other texts that contained similar theological challenges. The canonical Book of Enoch, for instance, appears in the New Testament letter of Jude, yet 1 Enoch, which contains far more elaborate angelological speculation than anything in Jubilees, was also suppressed in the West while being preserved in Ethiopia. The calendar controversy that was used to justify rejecting Jubilees becomes even more ironic when we consider the actual historical development of Jewish and Christian liturgical calendars. The lunar calendar that the Pharisees adopted from Babylon was indeed problematic, just as Jubilees had predicted. The book's prophecy that following the moon would cause the Jews to lose 10 days per year proved remarkably accurate. Yet the religious authorities who made this calendrical error used the solar calendar's mathematical imprecision as grounds for rejecting the entire book. The legal additions in Jubilees, which were criticized as dangerous innovations, actually reflect authentic traditions that can be traced to early Jewish interpretation of biblical law. Recent scholarship has shown that many of the legal positions taken in Jubilees align with practices that were common in Second Temple Judaism, suggesting that the book was preserving genuine early traditions rather than inventing new requirements. Even the elaborate angelological teachings that troubled later religious authorities find parallels in other ancient Jewish texts that were considered more acceptable. The difference wasn't the content itself, but the systematic and authoritative way that Jubilees presented these teachings. The book didn't offer speculation about angelic hierarchies. It claimed to reveal the definitive truth about how God had organized the spiritual realm. This brings us to perhaps the most significant aspect of the Jubilees controversy: the question of ongoing revelation. The books claimed to be direct divine revelation given to Moses alongside the Torah, challenged the emerging consensus about the closure of biblical revelation. Religious authorities in the 4th century were trying to establish clear boundaries around divine revelation, and texts that claimed equal authority with established scripture threatened those boundaries. But the Qumran discoveries reveal that this concept of closed revelation was itself a later development. The sectarian communities that preserved Jubilees also produced other texts claiming divine inspiration and prophetic authority. They lived in a religious world where revelation was understood to be ongoing, where faithful communities could receive new insights into God's will and plan for history. The suppression of Jubilees thus represents more than the rejection of a single controversial book. It represents a fundamental shift in how religious communities understood their relationship to divine revelation. The dynamic, ongoing revelation that characterized Second Temple Judaism was replaced by a static, closed system that prioritized institutional authority over prophetic insight. This shift had profound consequences for the development of both Judaism and Christianity. The rich theological diversity that characterized the Second Temple period was gradually replaced by more uniform, centrally controlled religious systems. Books like Jubilees, which represented alternative approaches to understanding biblical truth, were systematically eliminated in favor of interpretations that supported institutional authority. The Ethiopian preservation of these texts thus represents more than just cultural conservation. It represents the survival of an alternative model of religious authority, one that was more inclusive of diverse perspectives and more open to the possibility that divine truth could be found in multiple sources. The Ethiopian Orthodox canon, with its 81 books, reflects a completely different approach to the question of what constitutes authoritative scripture. When European missionaries first encountered Ethiopian Christianity in the modern period, they were shocked to discover communities that had preserved texts unknown to Western scholarship while maintaining Christian faith and practice for over a millennium. The assumption that Western Christianity represented the authentic tradition while Ethiopian Christianity was somehow deficient or corrupted proved to be completely backwards. The Ethiopian Christians had preserved not just the Book of Jubilees, but an entire library of ancient texts that revealed the theological richness and diversity of early Christianity. Their manuscripts contained complete versions of books that were known in the West only through fragments and quotations. They had maintained traditions of biblical interpretation that could be traced directly back to the earliest Christian communities. The rediscovery of these Ethiopian manuscripts in the 18th and 19th centuries began the process of recovering the lost world of Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. Scholars gradually realized that the religious landscape of the ancient world had been far more complex and diverse than previously imagined. The texts had been suppressed as heretical, often contained authentic traditions that predated the authorities who condemned them. This recovery process accelerated dramatically with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Qumran library provided independent Hebrew confirmation of texts that had survived only in Ethiopian translation. It revealed the theological sophistication of ancient, sectarian communities and demonstrated that many supposedly late or corrupt texts actually preserved very early traditions. The vindication of the Book of Jubilees through these discoveries raises troubling questions about what other ancient texts may have been unjustly suppressed. If a book that was found in multiple copies at Qumran, quoted by apostles, and cited by early church fathers could be so thoroughly erased from Western Christianity, what other treasures of ancient religious thought may have been lost forever? The answer is both sobering and inspiring. Sobering because we now know that the process of canonical formation involved the deliberate destruction of texts that many ancient communities considered sacred. Inspiring because the survival of texts like Jubilees in isolated communities like Ethiopia demonstrates the resilience of authentic religious tradition, even in the face of systematic suppression. The story of the forbidden Book of Jubilees thus becomes a lens through which we can examine the entire process of how religious traditions develop and change over time. It reveals the political and practical considerations that often drive theological decisions. It demonstrates the importance of diverse preservation efforts in maintaining the full richness of ancient religious thought. And it challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about which ancient voices deserve to be heard and which deserve to be silenced. As we piece together this remarkable story of suppression and survival, we begin to see a pattern that extends far beyond the Book of Jubilees itself. This wasn't an isolated incident of religious censorship. This was part of the systematic transformation of how ancient communities understood divine revelation, biblical authority, and the very nature of sacred text. The 4th century marked a turning point in religious history that would reshape Christianity for millennia to come. Emperor Constantine's conversion had made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. But this victory came with an unexpected cost. The diverse, dynamic religious movement that had grown organically in small communities across the Mediterranean was suddenly required to present a unified face to an empire that demanded doctrinal consistency. Picture the challenge facing church leaders of this era. They had inherited a rich tradition of theological diversity, with different communities emphasizing different aspects of Christian faith and preserving different collections of sacred texts. Some communities, heavily influenced by Jewish sectarian groups, treasured books like Jubilees and Enoch alongside the Gospels and Apostolic letters. Others, more influenced by Greek philosophical traditions, preferred texts that emphasized theological speculation and mystical experience. The solution they chose would echo through history. Rather than celebrating this diversity as a sign of Christianity's adaptability and richness, they decided to impose uniformity. They would create a single standardized canon that all Christian communities would be required to accept. Any text that didn't fit this emerging consensus would be not just excluded, but actively suppressed. The Book of Jubilees became one of the first casualties of this new approach. Its detailed chronological system, which divided all of history into precise mathematical periods, conflicted with the more flexible approaches to biblical interpretation that were becoming favored by imperial Christianity. Its elaborate legal requirements went beyond what most Christian communities were prepared to implement. Most problematically, its claim to be direct divine revelation challenged the emerging doctrine that revelation had been completed with the apostolic writings. But the suppression campaign faced an unexpected obstacle. The book was simply too popular, too widely distributed. and too deeply embedded in Christian tradition to disappear quietly. Copies existed in communities scattered across 3 continents. Translations had been made into multiple languages. Most challenging of all, the book had been extensively quoted by respected Christian teachers whose own writings were considered authoritative. The solution was as systematic as it was ruthless. Rather than simply stopping the copying of new manuscripts, church authorities launched what can only be described as a search and destroy mission. Existing copies were confiscated and burned. Scribes were forbidden from making new copies. Libraries were purged of any trace of the forbidden text. But destroying the books themselves wasn't enough. The extensive quotations in earlier Christian writings posed an ongoing threat. How could authorities explain why respected teachers like Justin Martyr and Origen had quoted extensively from a text that was now declared heretical? The solution was to begin editing these earlier works, removing or obscuring references to Jubilees wherever possible. This editorial campaign was remarkably successful. Many of the quotations that modern scholars have identified as coming from Jubilees were not recognized as such until the Ethiopian manuscripts were rediscovered. The references had been so thoroughly disguised or removed that later generations of Christians had no idea. Their theological ancestors had considered this forbidden book to be scripture. The psychological impact of this campaign extended far beyond the destruction of manuscripts. Christian communities learned that texts they had treasured, teachings they had received from respected leaders, and traditions they had maintained for generations could suddenly be declared not just wrong, but dangerously heretical. The message was clear. Theological authority now flowed from institutional hierarchy, not from ancient tradition or community consensus. This shift had profound implications for how Christians understood their relationship to sacred text. Previously, different communities had maintained different collections of authoritative writings, with considerable overlap but also significant variation. Local traditions, apostolic connections, and community consensus had all played roles in determining which texts were considered sacred. The new model centralized this authority in the hands of bishops who were increasingly aligned with imperial power. The Book of Jubilees represented everything that this new system opposed. It was decentralized, with different communities preserving different versions and traditions. It was democratically authorized, having gained acceptance through popular use rather than official decree. Most threateningly, it was independently validated, claiming divine authority that didn't depend on institutional approval. The calendar controversy that surrounded Jubilees provides a perfect example of how practical concerns became theological weapons. The book's solar calendar wasn't just mathematically imprecise. It represented a completely different approach to organizing religious life. Communities that followed the Jubilees calendar would celebrate their holy days at different times than communities that followed the lunar calendar adopted from Babylon. In a unified empire with standardized religious practices, this kind of variation was intolerable. Imperial Christianity needed all communities to celebrate Easter on the same day, to observe the same feast days, and to follow the same liturgical calendar. The solar calendar of Jubilees, regardless of its theological merits, represented a threat to this standardization. But there's a deeper irony here that reveals the arbitrary nature of many canonical decisions. The lunar calendar that the religious authorities defended as orthodox was itself a foreign import, borrowed from Babylonian astronomical traditions. The solar calendar that they rejected as heretical was actually more consistent with the agricultural rhythms of biblical Palestine and the natural cycles that governed Jewish religious life. The Book of Jubilees had predicted exactly what would happen if Jewish communities abandoned their traditional solar reckoning in favor of lunar calculations borrowed from their captors. The text warned that following the moon would cause the festivals to drift away from their proper agricultural timing, creating confusion and spiritual corruption. This prophecy proved remarkably accurate as Jewish communities struggled with calendrical problems for centuries after adopting the Babylonian system. Yet the religious authorities who witnessed these problems developing used the mathematical imprecision of the solar calendar as justification for rejecting the entire book. They preferred a foreign import that created ongoing practical difficulties over an indigenous tradition that had predicted those very difficulties. The decision reveals how political and cultural considerations often trumped theological and practical wisdom in canonical decisions. The legal expansions in Jubilees present another fascinating case. Studying how practical concerns shaped theological judgments. The book didn't just retell biblical stories. It provided detailed legal interpretations and additional commandments that went far beyond what was explicitly stated in the Torah. For religious authorities trying to maintain order in diverse communities, these additions represented unwelcome complications. Consider the book's prohibition against intermarriage with Gentiles. While this restriction had biblical precedent, Jubilees stated it in absolute terms and demanded extreme punishments for violations. In the cosmopolitan world of the Roman Empire, where Christian communities included both Jewish and Gentile converts, such rigid ethnic boundaries were not just impractical, but potentially subversive to imperial unity. Similarly, the book's elaborate Sabbath regulations went far beyond biblical requirements and created detailed restrictions that would have been difficult to implement in urban environments. The text demanded death penalties for violations that most Christian communities had learned to handle through less severe disciplinary measures. From the perspective of church leaders trying to integrate Christianity into Roman society, these requirements represented dangerous extremism. But recent scholarship has revealed that many of these supposedly excessive legal positions actually preserved authentic traditions from Second Temple Judaism. The intermarriage prohibitions, the Sabbath regulations, and the ritual purity requirements found in Jubilees all have parallels in other ancient Jewish texts that were considered more acceptable. The difference wasn't necessarily the content itself, but the authoritative way that Jubilees presented these teachings. Other ancient texts might discuss these legal traditions as scholarly opinions or community practices. Jubilees presented them as direct divine commandments, revealed by angels to Moses on Mount Sinai. This claim to absolute authority made the text far more threatening to religious establishments that were trying to maintain flexibility in their legal interpretations. The angelological teachings in Jubilees created similar problems for different reasons. The book's detailed descriptions of angelic hierarchies, fallen angels, and demonic influences provided a sophisticated theological framework for understanding the spiritual dimensions of human experience. But this sophistication came at a cost that many religious authorities found unacceptable. Popular religious movements have always been attracted to elaborate supernatural explanations for the problems and mysteries of human existence. The detailed angelology of Jubilees appealed to communities that were looking for spiritual answers to practical problems. Why do good people suffer? Because demons are actively working to corrupt God's creation. Why do some people seem naturally evil? Because they're influenced by the disembodied spirits of the giants who perished in the flood. These explanations were theologically sophisticated and biblically grounded, but they also opened the door to speculation and interpretation that could lead communities in directions that institutional authorities couldn't control. Religious leaders who were trying to maintain doctrinal uniformity preferred simpler, theological frameworks that left less room for individual interpretation and community variation. The irony is that many of the angelological concepts that were considered dangerous in Jubilees actually became central to later Christian theology through different channels. The idea that demons are fallen angels who actively tempt human beings became standard Christian teaching. The concept that spiritual warfare underlies many human conflicts became fundamental to Christian understanding of moral struggle. The belief that angelic beings play important roles in God's government of creation became basic Christian doctrine. But these ideas were acceptable when they came through channels that religious authorities could control and interpret. They became dangerous when they appeared in texts that claimed independent divine authority, and provided detailed systematic explanations that went beyond what institutional leaders were prepared to endorse. The suppression of Jubilees thus reveals a consistent pattern in how religious institutions handle threatening texts. Content that might be acceptable in small doses or when filtered through approved interpreters becomes dangerous when presented systematically in texts that claim independent authority. The problem isn't necessarily what these texts teach, but how they teach it and who has the authority to interpret their meaning. This pattern helps explain why the Book of Jubilees could be simultaneously influential and forbidden. Early Christian leaders could quote its insights when those insights supported their own teachings. They could reference its chronological framework when it helped explain biblical history. They could draw from its legal traditions when they needed precedents for community discipline. But they couldn't accept the book's claim to be direct divine revelation that stood on equal footing with the Torah and the Gospels. The Ethiopian preservation of Jubilees represents a completely different approach to these questions of authority and interpretation. Rather than viewing diverse texts as threats to institutional control, Ethiopian Christianity developed a more inclusive understanding of how divine revelation works in human communities. Their biblical canon includes texts that were suppressed elsewhere, not because they were less concerned with orthodoxy, but because they had a different understanding of how orthodoxy is maintained. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition suggests that theological truth is best preserved through diversity rather than uniformity, through inclusion rather than exclusion, through community discernment rather than institutional decree. Their preservation of texts like Jubilees alongside more conventional biblical books reflects a confidence that authentic divine revelation will ultimately vindicate itself through its spiritual fruits rather than through official endorsement. This alternative approach proved remarkably successful in preserving ancient traditions that were lost elsewhere. When European scholars finally gained access to Ethiopian manuscripts, they discovered not just individual texts, but entire theological traditions that provided crucial insights into the development of early Christianity. The Ethiopian Church had maintained a living connection to the theological world of the Second Temple period that had been severed elsewhere. The vindication of the Ethiopian approach through the Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries represents one of the most remarkable reversals in the history of biblical scholarship. For centuries, Western scholars had dismissed Ethiopian Christianity as somehow deficient or corrupted because it preserved texts that weren't found in Western canons. The assumption was that if these texts had been truly authentic and important, they would have been preserved in the mainstream traditions of Eastern and Western Christianity. The Qumran discoveries proved this assumption completely wrong. The texts that Ethiopian Christians had faithfully preserved for over a millennium were indeed authentic products of ancient Jewish and Christian communities. Their preservation in Ethiopia wasn't evidence of theological corruption, but of theological fidelity. The Ethiopian Christians had maintained traditions that could be traced directly back to the time of Christ and the Apostles. This reversal has profound implications for how we understand the relationship between institutional authority and authentic tradition. The religious authorities who suppressed texts like Jubilees believed they were protecting Christian communities from dangerous innovations and heretical teachings. But the archaeological evidence suggests they were actually destroying authentic traditions that connected their communities to the earliest layers of Christian faith. The Book of Jubilees wasn't a late sectarian innovation created by marginal communities trying to challenge Orthodox Christianity. It was an early Jewish text that had been influential in the very communities that gave birth to Christianity itself. Its suppression didn't protect Christian orthodoxy. It severed Christianity's connection to important aspects of its own theological heritage. This pattern of well-intentioned destruction of authentic tradition appears repeatedly in the history of religious institutions. Authorities who believe they are protecting their communities from error often end up destroying elements of their own heritage that later generations would value highly. The systematic campaign against Jubilees represents this dynamic on a massive scale. But the story of Jubilees also demonstrates the remarkable resilience of authentic religious tradition. Despite centuries of systematic suppression, despite the destruction of countless manuscripts, despite the editing of quotations in earlier Christian writings, the essential content of this forbidden book survived in isolated communities that maintained different approaches to canonical authority. The Ethiopian preservation of Jubilees stands as a testament to the importance of theological diversity in maintaining authentic religious tradition. If all Christian communities had adopted the same approach to canonical questions, if all had followed the same institutional authorities and accepted the same restrictions on sacred text, then this remarkable book would have been lost forever. Instead, the theological independence of Ethiopian Christianity provided a refuge for ancient texts that were being destroyed elsewhere. Their different approach to questions of canonical authority created space for traditions that couldn't survive in more restrictive environments. Their confidence in community discernment allowed them to preserve texts whose value would only become apparent to the wider Christian world many centuries later. The rediscovery of the complete Book of Jubilees through Ethiopian manuscripts thus represents more than just the recovery of a single ancient text. It represents the vindication of alternative approaches to maintaining religious tradition and the validation of communities that refuse to surrender their theological independence to centralizing institutional authorities. As we continue to unravel the mystery of why this remarkable book was forbidden and how it survived, we begin to see that the story of Jubilees is really the story of how religious traditions develop, change, and preserve themselves across centuries of political and theological upheaval. It's a story that challenges our assumptions about how divine revelation works in human communities and raises profound questions about the relationship between institutional authority and authentic spiritual tradition. The story of the Book of Jubilees forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how religious authority operates and how authentic spiritual tradition is preserved or destroyed. When we examine the complete arc of this forbidden book's journey through history, we discover patterns that extend far beyond ancient theological disputes into the very heart of how human communities understand divine truth. What emerges from this investigation is perhaps the most sobering lesson in the history of biblical literature. The same institutional authorities who claim to be protecting divine revelation from corruption were often the very forces that severed communities from their most authentic spiritual heritage. The suppression of Jubilees wasn't an isolated mistake made by well-meaning but misguided leaders. It was part of a systematic transformation that prioritized institutional control over theological truth. Consider what was lost when this book disappeared from Western Christianity. Gone was a detailed chronological framework that helped believers understand their place in God's plan for history. Gone were legal traditions that preserved authentic interpretations of biblical law from the Second Temple period. Gone were angelological teachings that provided sophisticated explanations for the spiritual dimensions of human experience. Most significantly, gone was an alternative model of divine revelation that emphasized ongoing prophetic insight rather than closed institutional authority. But the loss extended beyond theological content to something even more fundamental. The suppression of Jubilees represented the triumph of uniformity over diversity, of institutional decree over community discernment, of political convenience over spiritual authenticity. It marked a decisive moment when Christianity chose the path of imperial conformity rather than the messy vitality of grassroots theological development. The Ethiopian preservation of this text thus becomes more than just an act of cultural conservation. It represents resistance to this centralizing tendency, a refusal to surrender theological independence to distant authorities who claim the right to determine which ancient voices deserve to be heard. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church's inclusion of Jubilees in their 81-book biblical canon stands as a living testimony to alternative possibilities for how Christian communities might have developed if they had maintained greater openness to diverse expressions of divine revelation. The Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries vindicated this Ethiopian approach in ways that few could have imagined. When archaeologists found multiple copies of Jubilees preserved alongside the most sacred texts of ancient Judaism, they weren't just recovering a lost manuscript. They were uncovering evidence that the theological world of the Second Temple period had been far richer and more complex than the simplified version that survived institutional suppression. The Qumran community's reverence for this text reveals that the earliest followers of Jewish and Christian faith lived in a religious universe where books like Jubilees weren't considered dangerous innovations, but essential guides to understanding God's will. Their careful preservation of multiple manuscripts demonstrates that these ancient believers saw no contradiction between maintaining orthodox faith and treasuring texts that later authorities would declare heretical. This creates a profound irony that strikes at the heart of how we understand religious authority. The communities that were closest to the origins of biblical faith, that lived during the time of Christ and the apostles, that produced some of our most important biblical manuscripts, treated the Book of Jubilees as authoritative scripture. Yet the institutional authorities who came centuries later, operating under completely different political and cultural pressures, declared this same text to be not just wrong but dangerously heretical. Who had the better claim to authentic tradition? The ancient scribes who lived and breathed the theological atmosphere of biblical times, or the imperial bishops who were trying to create uniform doctrine for a vast and diverse empire? The archaeological evidence suggests that the answer isn't what centuries of institutional teaching would have us believe. The rehabilitation of the Book of Jubilees through modern scholarship thus represents more than just the recovery of an ancient text. It represents a fundamental challenge to how we understand the development of biblical tradition and the nature of religious authority itself. If a book that was so thoroughly suppressed can be proven to have been central to the religious life of the earliest Christian communities, then what other assumptions about canonical development might need to be reconsidered? The implications extend far beyond academic biblical scholarship into questions that every believer must eventually confront. How do we distinguish between authentic spiritual tradition and institutional convenience? How do we honor the insights of ancient communities while acknowledging the legitimate concerns of religious authorities? How do we maintain unity and order without sacrificing the theological richness that comes from diverse perspectives on divine revelation? The Book of Jubilees offers no easy answers to these questions, but it does provide a powerful lens through which to examine them. Its story reveals both the dangers of unchecked institutional authority and the remarkable resilience of authentic spiritual tradition. It demonstrates that divine truth has a way of surviving even the most systematic attempts at suppression, often preserved in unexpected places by communities that refuse to surrender their theological independence. As we close this remarkable journey through the forbidden history of one of Christianity's most suppressed texts, we're left with profound questions about the nature of divine revelation and religious authority. The Book of Jubilees challenges us to look beyond the simplified narratives that institutional authorities have constructed about their own legitimacy, and to consider the possibility that authentic spiritual truth might be found in places that those authorities have declared off limits. The Ethiopian Christians who preserved this text for over a millennium while it was being systematically destroyed elsewhere weren't theological rebels or dangerous heretics. They were faithful communities who maintained traditions that connected them directly to the earliest layers of Christian faith. Their preservation of texts like Jubilees represents one of the most important acts of cultural and spiritual conservation in human history. The Dead Sea Scrolls discoveries confirmed what these Ethiopian communities had maintained all along, that the theological world of ancient Judaism and early Christianity was far richer and more diverse than later institutional developments would suggest. The books that were suppressed as dangerous innovations were often authentic products of the very communities that gave birth to biblical faith itself. This story should humble all of us who care about authentic spiritual tradition. It reveals how easily well-intentioned religious authorities can become instruments of theological impoverishment rather than spiritual enrichment. It demonstrates the crucial importance of maintaining diverse approaches to understanding divine revelation rather than surrendering all interpretive authority to centralizing institutions. Most importantly, the story of the forbidden Book of Jubilees reminds us that divine truth has a remarkable ability to survive and resurface even after centuries of suppression. The same God who inspired the original authors of this ancient text ensured its preservation in communities that valued theological diversity over institutional uniformity. Its rediscovery in our time isn't just an archaeological curiosity, but a divine reminder that authentic spiritual tradition cannot be permanently destroyed by human authorities, no matter how systematic their efforts. The Book of Jubilees remains forbidden in many Christian traditions, but its survival and vindication stand as powerful testimony to the resilience of divine revelation and the importance of maintaining openness to the diverse ways that God has spoken to human communities throughout history. Its story challenges all of us to consider whether we're truly seeking divine truth or simply accepting the theological limitations that institutional authorities have placed on our spiritual inheritance. If this exploration has opened your eyes to the complex and often troubling history of how our biblical traditions developed, then share this video with others who need to hear this story. The suppression of the Book of Jubilees represents just one example of how authentic spiritual tradition has been shaped by political and institutional concerns rather than pure theological considerations. By understanding this history, we can better appreciate the remarkable diversity of divine revelation and the importance of maintaining communities that refuse to surrender their theological independence to centralizing authorities. The forbidden Book of Jubilees survived against impossible odds to deliver its message to our generation. Its story reminds us that divine truth cannot be permanently suppressed and that authentic spiritual tradition will always find ways to preserve itself, even in the most unlikely places. That's a message worth preserving, worth sharing, and worth remembering as we continue our own journey of faith in a world that still struggles with questions of religious authority and authentic spiritual truth.